Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. Today we're going to be going over some of the organs of the digestive system and going over a lot of them in great detail. So I'm going to move the camera around. I'm going to try to do this so you don't get too dizzy. You can see one of our mannequins here. His breastplate has been removed, the lungs and the heart have been removed, and you can see a number of structures here. This tube would be the trachea, branching off into primary bronchi, going into the lungs. Running deep to the trachea, or posterior to it, and extending once the trachea ends, it continues down as this tube called the esophagus. This large brown organ would be the liver. If I take the liver out and tilt it back, you can see the gallbladder here underneath it. I'm going to remove all of that, and you can see how the esophagus here attaches to the stomach. The stomach has two curves to it. This outer edge out here is called the greater curvature because it's larger. This inner edge is called the lesser curvature. Our stomach is also divided into different regions, and I'll show you that on some different models. Now, as food passes from the esophagus into the stomach churns with a bunch of muscle layers to try to break up and mash the food up. And then the food is going to empty from here. As I remove the stomach, you'll see it's going to empty into a tube, and part of the model is missing. I don't have it with me, but there's the pancreas would be running across here, which we don't see, and the tube would empty into here and become this flesh-colored tube here. All of this is small intestine. And then over here that becomes the small intestine empties into the large intestine, which would come up as the ascending colon. It comes across here as the transverse colon. It would come down here as the descending colon. And then everything runs behind all of this. So I'm going to take these guts out and show them to you in a little bit more detail. Okay, so let me remove these. And I'm going to lay them over here on the table. Excuse me. And I'm also going to pan over to this other model. So I'm going to try not to make you dizzy. But I'm going to move the camera so we can focus on these two models. Now, this shows you the digestive tract. We've gone over this before. This is the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine or colon, and a section of the large intestine has been removed. Now I'm going to look at this model for a second. For one, it gives us a lot of perspective. It shows us where the lungs are. Here, let me sit down so that you're not just staring at my fat belly. So, you guys can see the trachea would be this blue pipe here. I can see the lungs with all the lobes. We've covered all of that. The heart is missing. This is obviously an A&P instructor because he's heartless or a clinical coordinator. You'll know what I mean when you get into your programs and go to clinics. But we can be rather heartless sometimes. But nonetheless, you can see the lungs here. I'm going to remove the lungs. And I can see this green tube would be the esophagus here. Now, this would be the liver. We're going to go over the liver in great detail later on. I pull the liver out, and if I look underneath it, I can see the gallbladder, this green bag here. This is the stomach. The stomach is actually laying somewhat on its side, and we're staring at this outer edge. The edge is called the greater curvature. And I can see where the esophagus is here, passing through the diaphragm, and the esophagus would attach here to the stomach as it curves around. I'm going to take the stomach out, and we can look at it. We're going to go over it in a second. This green structure here with the white tube would be the pancreas, and the stomach would have been attached right here, but we cut it and removed it. This is the beginning of the small intestine. It would run behind here and then start to coil up on itself. Now, all of our guts are covered with a fatty layer. We have two layers of fat in the abdomen. There's the subcutaneous fat, and then we have this deep layer of fat, which is called the omentum. Because this one was attached to the greater curvature of the stomach, they've removed a section of it, but it would have been attached here and draped over everything. It's called the greater omentum. Now, in this view, I can see the beginning of the small intestine. I get lost in the coil here. But if I remove this section of the transverse colon, I can see the pancreas a little bit better. I can see where the initial portion of the small intestine called the duodenum would come across and connect here. We're going to slice it and remove all of the small intestine. And I also had to slice the end of it. So this would be the duodenum. It comes over here and then hooks then it changes names to jejunum. Somewhere in the middle becomes the ileum, and the very last piece right here is the end of the ileum. The ileum is going to empty into the large intestine or colon. There's several structures here that you can see. This is the appendix here. You can see the appendix there as well. And I can see how the ileum right here connects to and empties into this little pouch. This little pouch at the very beginning of the large intestine, where the appendix and the ileum attach, is called the cecum, C-E-C-U-M. So this is the cecum, and that's the cecum there. And then the food would enter, or the digestive contents would go up the ascending colon, because it goes up here. On this model, we've removed it, but on this model, I actually have a piece of it. This would be called the transverse colon. On this model, this band is painted white. On the other one, it's not. But the whole organ would be called the transverse colon. This portion is called the descending colon. And then if I remove this and look at it carefully, you can see how it makes this funky little S shape. In the Greek alphabet, sigma is the letter S, so this is called the sigmoid colon. So when people get a sigmoidoscopy, they look there. They stick a camera in and look at the sigmoid colon. If you get a colonoscopy or a lower endoscopy, they run a camera all the way through here. They have a camera long enough to run through most of the colon. This tan area would be called the rectum, and the opening would be called the anus. So now I'm going to go over some of these models in a little bit more detail. So let me slide all this aside for a second. And then one last thing I want to show you is on our smaller mannequin, sometimes we have pictures of these. I don't like them as much, but here you can see the stomach. You can see the greater curvature on the outside, the lesser curvature here. I can see the small intestine. I can see the large intestine running across here, coming down, and then some of it would be attached in there and it's actually missing, which is why I don't like this model. It's missing a lot of pieces. So I'm going to set all that aside. Now that we have sort of an overview of all the organs from different models, esophagus, stomach, liver, gallbladder, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, I can zoom in on some details. So let me pull this aside a little bit. And I'm going to move that model back in because I want to show you some of these details on both this model. We're going to look at the stomach in great detail, and then we'll come back to this other model in a second. When I'm looking at this model, one of the things I notice, I can see the outer edge is the greater curvature, the inner edge is the lesser curvature. This end is where the esophagus would attach. This is the end that attaches to the small intestine. If I break the stomach open, I notice that inside the stomach there's all these bumps or folds. If I slide this model back in, I can see the lesser curvature here and the greater curvature on the outside. Here's the pancreas, that's the spleen. Now look at all the ridges or folds on the inside of the stomach. Those are, each fold individually is called a ruga, R-U-G-A. Plural would be called rugae, R-U-G-A-E. So all of these folds or bumps inside the stomach are called rugae. We're going to talk about this in lecture, but when the stomach is full, the rugae disappear. Kind of like taking a crumbled up grocery bag, the little plastic ones, and if you filled it with fluid or food, it would start to lose its fold and become distended. So our stomach is all folded up on the inside and rugae when it's empty, and then when we're full, the rugae allow for the stomach to expand and contract. That movement, that ability to change shape to accommodate changes in volume is called it's called compliance. We're going to talk a lot about compliance when we do the respiratory system. So now, well, if I look at this part of the stomach, one last thing I want to show. Well, let me show you this first. If I could draw a piece of, or draw a line all the way across right here, draw another line here and another one here, I could divide the stomach into 4 regions. Sorry, my lights went out whenever there's not enough movement in the room, and I'm not going to reshoot this video. So this little upper pouch up here, this area is called the fundus. The fundus is sort of like the overflow pouch. Once our stomach starts to fill up, it fills up from this end to this end. This area would be called the fundus. When the fundus starts to stretch, that's when you feel really full. Now, if I could cover up the fundus here and draw a line straight across here, this next region where the esophagus empties into is called the cardia. And the reason is is because the heart is sitting right above that, separated by the diaphragm, but this area of the stomach would be called the cardia. This middle part of the stomach is called the body, and then this last little area, about from this flexure to the end, is called the pylorus, or the pyloric region. We have the fundus, or fundic region, the cardia, or cardiac region, the body, and then the pylorus, or pyloric region. Now, let me grab this other thing. If I look at the inside of the stomach, one of the things that I can see if I look very closely here at the pylorus is it starts to pinch in just a little bit right there. Our digestive system and the human body has a number of sphincter type muscles, or annular muscle. Anu comes from ring. It's a term for the word ring, like a ring-shaped structure. That's where the term anus comes from, which is a ring-shaped muscle that can relax and contract to let things pass through. Well, we actually have a sphincter up here in the esophagus called the hiatal sphincter, or esophageal sphincter, or cardiac sphincter of the stomach. We can't see it on our models, but we do see this sphincter muscle right here. And this ring-shaped muscle is in the pyloric region. It's called the pyloric sphincter. And it can clamp up and hold food in your stomach for 2 to 3 hours after you've eaten. So that's the pyloric sphincter right there. And then you see the rugae. Now, if I look back at the outside of the stomach, I can see there's a series of lines or channels or grooves running across here, and there's a little square cutout, and then I have these grooves again. Most of the digestive tract, within the wall of the digestive tract, there are 2 layers of muscle. One called the muscularis interna, one's called the muscularis externa. Each one of those layers has 2 sublayers. The inner layer is always circular, the outer layer is always longitudinal. So the circular muscles fibers would be running like this in a ring, and the longitudinal muscles would be running the length of the stomach and the small intestine, the large intestine, parts of the esophagus. Now, the stomach is unique in that on the muscularis externa, the outer layer of muscle, there's actually 3 layers to the muscularis externa. The inner is always circular, the outer is always longitudinal, but there's another layer that's inside the circular muscle. And we can see a little cutout of the circular muscle here, and I see these lines running this way. Those muscle fibers are running at a funky angle, and that's called the oblique muscle. So, if I ask you to identify the muscle running with these lines, this is the longitudinal muscle. I can see the longitudinal muscle fibers running the length of the stomach. These lines running here are the circular muscles, because they would go around the stomach in a ring. And then this little cutout shows us the lines of the oblique muscle. So if I ask you to ID the muscle layer, longitudinal muscle, ID the layer, circular muscle, ID the layer or the muscle layer, that would be the oblique muscle. Okay? So now, we've covered the stomach. On this model, I don't have the outer part, so I can't see all of this, but if I drew a line across here, this would be the fundus. This area here would be the cardia. The middle section would be the body, and then here I would see the pylorus, and this little pinching in area is where the pyloric sphincter is. Once the pyloric sphincter relaxes, food falls into the duodenum. That's the initial portion of the small intestine. The duodenum is about 8 to 10 inches long, and it extends from here, it'll run across, and then it hooks, and once it hooks, it changes names. So now, if I pick up this model, I can see the pancreas here, this green-looking structure with the white line running across it. The stomach would be attached and sitting like this. If I remove the stomach, all of this light green tube here would be called the duodenum. It's the initial portion of the small intestine. So if I ask you to identify this specific part of the tube, or this specific part of the tube, you would say duodenum. Now, the duodenum would be attached. You see that dark green dot? That would be attached right there, and it would sit like this. So I know that right where I cut this model, this is part of the jejunum, and it would coil up, and then eventually I would lose where the jejunum goes because it's all piled up. But this middle portion would be jejunum. And then the bottom part, just for ease of understanding right now, this would be your ileum down here. On the back side, I can see the green dot would be the opening of our ileum, where it was connected to this, and that's the end of the ileum. So if I ask you to identify this part of the tube, you say duodenum, this part of the tube, jejunum, this part of the tube would be ileum. Here I can see the duodenum, this would be jejunum, and I know this end part would all be ileum. So now, if that's the ileum is going to empty into the cecum of the large intestine through this opening right here. That opening is also another sphincter muscle that can clamp up and hold digestive contents in the small intestine, where we do most of our nutrient absorption. So once we need food to pass, or the digestive contents to pass from the small intestine, the ileum itself, into the colon, this muscle can relax. That opening is called the ileocecal valve. The ileocecal valve. And of course, also attached to the cecum is the appendix here. Then the digestive contents will move up the ascending colon. They will move across the transverse colon here. Let me put this together. And then they would come down the descending colon, all of this portion here. And the ascending colon is always over here on the right side of your body. The transverse colon runs across, and the descending colon is on the left side. Now, our small intestine would be covering most of this, but once we remove it, I can see this section called the sigmoid colon. One of the other structures, or two of the other structures I want you to see here is this. If you notice on the surface of the large intestine, it has all these little pouches, or these little pockets that go all the way along the surface. You can see the little lines. It is folded up into these little pouches called haustra. H-A-U-S-T-R-A. Sorry, my light keeps turning off because we have an automatic timer to save electricity, but if I'm not moving a lot, it will shut the lights off. I apologize, but I'm not starting this video over, as I said once before. These are the haustra, every little pocket. And when the colon is empty, it crumbles up on itself, and when it's full, it will distend. And there's a ligament running the entire, or a tendon-like structure running the entire length, this little line. And there's another one on the back side. There's actually two of these. And you can see they run the entire length here. On this part of the model, we actually painted it white. So you can see the individual haustra, but that white line, or this line running down the length of the entire colon, is called the tinea coli. It means the tendon of the colon. So that's the tinea coli, that tendon running all along it. So now I'm going to finish up the digestive system here. I want to do a couple of other models, and then we should be close to being done with the digestive tract. So now, if I zoom in on this section right here, where the duodenum and the pancreas is, and I have the liver and the gallbladder and the spleen, this model shows us a close-up of all of that. Now, this is the spleen here. It's not really attached to the pancreas physically or functionally, but they do have some connective tissue holding them. This is the duodenum, where it curves here. The pancreas is attached to the duodenum. This long white line running the length of the pancreas is called the pancreatic duct. The pancreatic duct will come down here and dump into the duodenum, releasing all the pancreatic enzymes. The pancreas itself has three areas. The area here where it's, or regions, the area or region where it's attached to the duodenum is called the head of the pancreas. The middle part is called the body of the pancreas, and then the tail of the pancreas is attached to the spleen over here. Now, if I look inside the small intestine, do you hear this? All those ridges are the folds of the small intestine. They are called plicae or plicae. P-L-I-C-A, plica or plica would be individual, and then plicae or plicae would be plural. Some people pronounce it plica, some say plica, but those are the plica of the small intestine, the folds in it. You can also see them here, and they run throughout the entire length of the small intestine. Now, if you notice on this model, the pancreatic duct comes across here and comes down. In roughly somewhere between 80 and 90%, about 85% of the human population, we have this extra duct here that the enzymes can run through, and that one is called the accessory duct. Okay, So we have the pancreatic duct, all of this white tube running through here, and then we have the little accessory duct. In this model, it's probably too small to see, but there would be two openings that the juices would drip into the duodenum, and those are called papillae, duodenal papillae. And there's a major papilla and a minor papilla. Now this model doesn't show it as well as this model does. So, I really like this model. Let me make sure I got a good close-up on it. Let me look through my camera. Oh man, have I been doing that the whole time?